this video is going to be a little bit different because I've got a helper with me in the workshop today. This is Stix. Say hello, Stix.
Hi.
And we're going to be making a picture frame.
For Christmas, Stix bought her mum this print by the artist Yellena James, and making a frame for it seemed like a good father-daughter woodworking project. The first thing to do was to get the dimensions of the print itself. Next, we add 50mm on all sides to allow for the mounting board. The mounting board is going to be recessed into the frame by about 10mm, and this allows us to calculate the internal dimensions of the frame. At this point, I don't know the dimensions of the material we're going to use, but we do know that the frame is going to consist of 4 boards joined with mitre corners. Knowing the internal sizes of these boards is all we need right now. The rest of the dimensions can be calculated once we've selected our stock. We found this Sapelli board in my wood store. It's 100mm wide and 19mm thick. We'll rip the board in half to about 50mm thick, and that should be ideal for our frame. Now that we know the width of our material, we can use this knowledge, along with the internal dimension, to calculate the length of each board we need to cut. We know we need a 45-degree mitre at each end of each board. This essentially means we're adding on a right-angled triangle at each end of the board. We know the length of the adjacent side because this is the width of the board once we've ripped it. It's simple trigonometry to work out the length of the opposite side, but given this is a right-angled triangle with two 45-degree angles, we know that both the opposite and adjacent sides are going to be the same, in this case 50mm. So, to get our final board length, we start with the internal length from our initial measurement. We then take the 50mm, which is the base of the triangle that we're going to put on each end, and add these together. This total is the outside length of our frame piece, which means it's the length of the board we need to cut for our top and bottom rails. We calculate the lengths of our side boards in exactly the same way. Stix then takes these calculations and puts together our cutting list. The first thing to do is to measure up the length of our first board. And mark it up. We're going to be cross-cutting this board, so we use a square and a knife to mark up where we're going to cut. We then use a square and the knife to trace this mark all the way around the board. We always position the square so that we're referencing from the same side.
Okay, you bring your knife in there, see, because that's where the cut is. Right, I bring the square up to it there, hold that knife, and we can go in like there. Okay, so then we've got a nice swing there. Now we can roll it over, and if we're lucky, that mark there that you've done and that one there, they should match up. Let's see if they do. You see that mark there to there? Yeah?
Yeah.
And then we can do this. Okay, so we've got this line going all the way around nice and square. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is the one we want. This is the side we're cutting up for this. Very good. So spin it round that way. says this is our waste side. And then we'll clamp this to the desk. Here. And we mal it. I'm going to tap it in at an angle, so we're going down till we hit that. And we just work it across. So it's something like that. Put it like that, and it's a, yeah? Into there. Into there. Like that. Okay, do you want to have a go? There you go.
Yeah.
Yep. There we go. Go. Okay. So this stuff just flakes out. Okay. So we've got this nice thing there.
Using the recess we've just chiselled as a guide for the saw, we then cross-cut. We use our knife marks as a guide and make sure that we cut on the waste side of the lines. I gave Stix a slightly smaller saw to work with, but she was still struggling. The problems she's having are common to most novice woodworkers. She's suffering a little from a lack of strength, but most of the problems are down to technique. The most common being an incorrect grip, a failure to keep the saw plate level and plumb, and a poor stance, meaning that your body mechanics are working against you rather than for you. To be fair, the bench here is a little big for Stix to be able to comfortably use. So a little later on we dug out some scrap wood and Stix spent some time just sawing and sawing and sawing. And now she's much better. Matt Eastley actually has a pretty good video on how to saw correctly, and so if you're looking for a few pointers, it's well worth checking out. So next we mark the board for the top and bottom rails to length. This time, however, I let Stix cut the board using the chop saw. I should point out, for health and safety reasons, that Stix here has had full instruction in how to use this saw and is working with full adult supervision. Kids, don't try this at home without an experienced adult to hand. She's wearing full eye and ear protection and a tight-fitting hat to keep her hair out of the way. I could get used to having an assistant in the workshop. So we know that our boards are currently 100mm thick, and actually we want them ripped in half. So one way to do it would be to use a handsaw and rip straight down. And to be honest, this is probably what I would usually do for a job this small. However, my shoulder was still recovering from an injury, and so I thought it was a great opportunity to show Stix how a table saw works, although only as a spectator this time. And now we have our boards cut to length and width. In order for all four mitered corners to come together perfectly and create a completely square frame, it's essential that all the boards are of uniform width. Therefore, I'm going to put everything together in the vise and plane them. This would be even more essential had I used a handsaw to rip the boards. I have my table saw and fence calibrated pretty well, so I don't need to do too much planing, and I have the cutting iron on the plane set with a fairly shallow cut. I use my fingers to feel for differences in the width, as the eye is easily deceived.
Okay. Excellent.
Once again, an eager helper helps to keep the workshop clean. So So let's arrange the boards to get a basic idea of how the frame will look. We then need to mark in the mitered corners. To cut the miters, I'm going to fix the matching boards together. This way I can cut the miters on both boards simultaneously and make sure that they're exactly the same. Some people use masking tape and superglue for this kind of thing, or even a hot glue gun, but I find that this strong double-sided tape makes everything feel more trustworthy, even if there is more effort required in separating the pieces and cleaning up afterwards. So we mark in the miters using a combination square on the 45-degree angle. The miter cut is still essentially a cross cut, and so we're going to use the knife and chisel technique here too. I initially mark the 45-degree angle and then trace around. First of all, I establish the cut using the chisel mark. However, it's imperative that not only is the angle cut to a perfect 45 degrees, the cut is also square across the face. So, I take a piece of scrap wood which is straight and square and clamp it to the workpiece in order to act as a sawing guide. I then saw down, making sure that the saw plate stays firmly against the side of the guide. Once I'm through the first board, with the start of the cut established in the second board, I can remove the guide and use the face of the first board to keep the second cut square. And that looks pretty good. Using the combination square, I'll check for accuracy, and it looks pretty good. That angle is 45 degrees, and it's also square across the face. However, I will finish it off with a shooting board once I've cut the rest of the miters. Hand sawing the other corners would have been a bit of a challenge for Stix, so it was back to the chop saw, this time cutting at a 45-degree angle. Note how Stix keeps her body perpendicular to the cut and keeps her arm directly in line with the motion of the saw, so that the blade is not pulled offline, compromising the accuracy of the cut. You'll also note that I forgot to hook the chop saw up to the vacuum extractor. But once again, having an assistant helps in this regard. The cuts may look accurate, but just to be sure, I use my shooting board to make sure that they're absolutely bang on. If you cut each of your miters individually, a shooting board is a great way to make sure that your opposing sides are of equal length. I'm kind of skirting over the usage of a shooting board here, but I'll make a video in the future at some point and cover things with a little more detail. That all looks good, but there's one real test. And that's to see if the corners come together to make a perfect right angle. Which they do. If things aren't quite right here, it's simply a case of going back to the shooting board and finessing things a little bit more. We could leave things as they are here if we wanted to have a very square frame, but I want to soften these internal angles a little bit, so I'm going to do that using the plane. By tilting the plane, I can put a bevel on the internal edge of the frame. However, to get this regular all the way round, I need to build a little jig. All I need are a couple of straight-edged square pieces of scrap. These are fixed together using the hot glue gun. And the back edges are lined up to make sure it's square. And that's it. The jig will take care of the width of the bevel along the surface of the frame. So I use a marking gauge to put a line to guide the depth of the bevel on the inside edge. I've set the depth such that there should be about 5 mm of edge left once I've taken the rebate into account. I mark each internal edge. Next, I put the jig and the workpiece together and clamp everything up in the vise. I add some extra clamps just to make sure the jig is secure. I set the plane to a fairly shallow cut, and then plane across the surface of the frame piece, ensuring that the edge of the plane runs along the straight edge of the jig. I am consciously tilting the plane slightly, but it is the design of the plane itself that actually allows the bevel to form. You can see that bevel angle starting to appear here. The main thing I'm concentrating on is looking at the depth line, and I'm going to keep going until the plane gets down to that depth. My only concern is that the depth line is equal along the entire length of the board. And I keep going until I'm down to depth. I'm constantly checking the depth of the cut against my gauge line and checking that the depth of cut is equal along the entire length. Accuracy is important here because when the corners come together everything needs to line up. That's why I have my plane set at a fairly shallow cut here. And there we have our finished bevel.
Feel this? Got that lip there, okay.
So the reason we're able to do this is down to the design of the plane. If we look at the bottom of the plane, we can see that the cutting iron doesn't go all the way to the edge. This means that the plane can't cut along its entire width. The edge of the sole has no cutting capability, and so it rides along the top surface of the wood. This allows the plane to tilt as we're using it.
It's not cutting, it's because you need to rotate it slightly. There you go, you're making shavings now.
This handy design feature and the use of the jig means that even a novice woodworker can add an attractive bevel without too much effort.
Yeah. Perfect.
As with the sawing, we found some scrap wood and Stix did some planing practice after this. But even with her first time using the plane, she was able to contribute to making the bevel. Until her arms got too tired. And there we have the bevel applied to two of the opposite edges.
Quite nice. Yeah.
We then repeat this process for the other two pieces. You may be able to see here that some of the grain is tearing out. This is because at this place in the wood, the grain is rising up to the surface and we're actually planing against it. In order to fix this, I'll take it down to depth a little bit this way round, and then I'll come in and plane in the opposite direction just to smooth everything off.
A lot smoother there now.
The reason for this approach is that I'm right-handed, and it's a lot easier for me to plane in that direction. So removing the bulk right-handed and then coming in and doing a few smoothing passes using my plane in the opposite way is a lot more comfortable.
See? All smooth. Yeah. Nice.
And that's the bevel applied to all of the edges. Some more tidying. Thank you very much.
Use this thing.
To make the frame look a little more interesting, I'm going to use this old moulding plane to add some detail to the outside edge. This particular moulding plane has a thin concave iron and is designed for adding a beading. The received wisdom for using a moulding plane is start towards the end of the job and then work your way backwards. It doesn't take long at all to cut the feature.
How's that look?
It's easy to pick these kind of old moulding planes up quite cheaply second hand. The only problem you might have is that there is a current trend for using these kind of things as ornaments. Not only does that increase the price slightly, but it also means that some of the planes have been cleaned and polished in a way that look nice, rather than in a way which contributes to the usability of the tool. So you may find yourself having to do a little bit of a restoration job. The cutting iron itself will definitely need sharpening. Now the tools themselves will have been developed for specific reasons. The original craftsman would have had a large number of these in various profiles and sizes. I, on the other hand, have picked up various of these over the years, without any kind of plan of collecting a set, and so what I tend to do is just find one that I think will work nicely for the job in hand.
Yeah? Look at that. Hey? That's alright, I can do that. I'll just push it through and look, I'll just tidy that up. Yeah? See? How's that?
Yeah.
Reckon, eh? Right, we can put this away.
So that's the shaping of the frame pieces complete. And if we put the pieces together at the corner, you can see how the bevel and the beading come together. That makes the frame a lot more interesting than the square stock we started with. Next we have to separate the pieces and get rid of the double-sided tape. If necessary, I use cellulose thinners or some white spirit to get rid of any residual stickiness. And here are our pieces, so let's lay them out and see what we're looking at. Starting to look like a picture frame. The next thing we need to do is cut the rebate or rabbet on the inside of the frame. This is where the glass, the picture and the backing board will sit. I set the fence and the depth stop on my 78 rabbet plane and start cutting in from the edge of the board. As per the moulding plane, I start cutting towards the end of the job and then work backwards along its length. I'm cutting the rebate to a depth of about 5mm to cover the glass and the backing board, and 10mm into the frame. This process is repeated on every edge. And once everything's cut, we'll arrange the frame. We're ready to glue up this stage, and so I get my band clamp dimensioned correctly. We place some greaseproof paper under each corner to catch any glue squeeze out. And then we start gluing up the corners. It should be pointed out that gluing up a mitre joint like this is an extremely weak joint. This is because we're gluing end grain to end grain, and that doesn't give us a great amount of bonding. We're going to be reinforcing this joint, so it's not going to be a problem for us here. But a glue up such as this should never be considered the end point of the job. I tighten up the band clamp and constantly go round and look at the corners to make sure everything's square. This really is the point in which everything can go wrong. And it really is important that all the 45-degree angles are cut accurately. The angles only need to be a fraction of a degree out, and the whole thing won't come together square. We left it to glue up overnight. As mentioned, this is a very weak joint at this stage, and so I want to give the glue plenty of time to cure. And it looks like everything's come together nicely. Now we need to do something about reinforcing these joints. And the method I've selected is to use a butterfly. So we're going to use this piece of card as a template. We fold the piece of card in half and then make our butterfly shape. We'll make the butterflies out of wood and then recess them into the corners like this. We'll need 4 butterflies in total, so we'll mark them up on this piece of wood. I'm used to calling this a butterfly, but there are several names including bowtie, dovetail key, Dutchman joint, etc. Often they're used for tying together a split in a piece of wood, but I think it's a great approach here for reinforcing those mitre corners. So it's simply a case of getting a saw and cutting out the shapes. This can either be done by hand, like so, or on a bandsaw. And this was a great opportunity to introduce Stix to the bandsaw. She has used a scroll saw or fret saw at school in the past, but this is the first time using a bandsaw. Again, this is done under strict supervision. Whether we've cut by hand or using a machine, it's best just to tidy up everything with a chisel. This helps us to get nice square edges and make the corners nice and crisp. And there are our pieces. Now, even though we've cut them to a template, they will be all slightly different. And so what we'll do is we'll choose what corner we're going to use them for and label up both the tie and the corner. Next, we'll mark up the position of each tie using a knife. I'll use a ruler and a knife to make these marks deeper. I clamp the job to my workbench for safety. And then use a chisel to remove the material. I start by slicing down from the middle to the knife mark. I do this all the way around. I then move back, clearing out more of the middle. With this initial material removed, I can now put the chisel straight along the knife line and chop down into it to increase the depth. I have to remove the material in the middle first, because if I started just by chopping down on the knife line, the bevel shape on the front of the chisel would force the chisel backwards into the wood, effectively widening the hole. This would mean that the bow tie didn't fit properly. We can see here that there's plenty of room for the bevel. Once I've made the edges deeper, I can go back to removing the material from the middle. As with anything, it's important to have nice sharp tools. I'll use a slightly smaller chisel to get into the middle. Rotating the chisel so that I can use it bevel down helps to flatten the bottom. I'll try the fit. That looks pretty good, so I need to just continue down to depth. I'm using a small router plane to smooth off the bottom just because I have one. It's possible to get it flat enough just using the chisel. So once everything's cut, I add some glue to the recess, spread it around, and place in the bow tie and tap it home with the rubber end of a mallet. I've purposely left the bow tie proud of the surface. This is so I can trim it down later when everything's glued up for a nice finish. I then repeat this process on the other 3 corners. I always try to cut everything as accurately and neatly as possible, but this is going on the back side of the frame, so if it is a little raggedy in places, it won't be seen by anyone. If you like the bow ties, you could put them on the front of the frame, of course. I'm not a massive fan of the use of the bow tie as a design feature myself, but it's certainly a very good mechanical solution for reinforcing this kind of joint. And there we go. I'll leave everything to glue up. And once the glue's cured, we can remove the excess material and make everything nice and flat. I start by using a sharp chisel to pare off the excess. I use a slicing motion and keep the back of the chisel flat to the frame. I get everything as close as I can with the chisel and then finish off using a plane. And there we go. Not my neatest work, but it's not going to be seen, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. I then repeat this process for the other 3 corners. This approach makes for a very strong frame. Usually I'd prefer to use a joint such as a 10-end mitre, but this was probably too complicated a joint for this father-daughter project. And this is a perfectly valid approach for someone still working up to a more complicated joint. Starting to look good. The last thing to do is just to do a little bit of sanding to round off any of the sharper corners. I just hold the sandpaper at a slight angle just to round off those edges. Finally, a small amount of sanding to the surface. I use my block plane to round off the inside edges. This is all just to make it more comfortable when handling. I just make a few passes rotating the angle of the plane as I go. And finish off with a bit of sanding on the back. Now it's time to measure up to cut the glass. Rather than glass, I'm going to use some perspex. This is 3mm thick. It's actually a clear, transparent perspex. The blue colour comes from the protective paper. I mark out the dimensions using a square and then use a jigsaw to cut to size. I'm using a fine-tooth blade on the jigsaw. Handsawing this would probably result in me cracking the perspex. And that fits in there just like that. Next I'm going to cut the backing board. I'm going to use this fibre board and mark it up to the exact same size as the plastic. This I can cut by hand, and a handsaw makes very short work of the job. I just use a plane to neaten up the edges. And that'll fit in there like that. Next we need to think about the mount. I start by cutting the mounting card to the same dimensions as the backing board and the glass. Then I find the centre. From the centre point, I measure out to find the dimensions for the internal side of the backing board. Now, traditionally, the internal cut in the mount will be cut with a bevel. So I've made myself this little tool to achieve that. It's just a block of wood with a 45-degree angle and a rebate cut so it can slide along this track. I use a standard marking knife blade which I hold out of position when not in use. I then loosen the clamp, position the blade and screw it in place. And screw down the clamp. This leaves the blade protruding out of the bottom of the tool. I mark in the position for the track, place the track on the board, place the tool on the track, press down and score across until I get to each corner. As you can see, I've cut all the way through. I repeat this process for each edge. There's a little stubborn bit I've missed there, so I'll just tweak it with a knife. And that's the centre removed, and we have a nice bevel around the inside. And I'll just tidy the blade away so it doesn't cut anything when not in use. And this is how it looks when the picture is in the mount. It's now time to finish the frame, and I'm going to do this with several layers of Danish oil. I always dispense some of the oil into a jar for application. The oil will react with the air, so the less time the lid is off the tin the better. For the first layer I put a decent covering on using a paper towel. I apply liberally and then I'll leave everything several hours for the oil to soak in. I then come back and give everything a light sanding using a very high grade glass paper. This is to get everything nice and smooth. We then add another layer of oil. In total we added 5 layers of oil to this project, sanding down in between each. This results not only in a hard wearing finish, but also in a nice pleasing shine. Finally we add some furniture wax. We apply liberally with the cloth. And then buff it out. Next we put everything together. Firstly the glass goes in, then the mount, then the picture, which I'll put a little bit of tape in the corners to stop it moving about, then the backing board, and then we'll use some framers tape to keep everything in position. And here's the finished piece. I think Stix was very pleased with it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like and subscribe to the channel for more projects.